Hello and welcome to our Week 3 lecture on classical theories of capitalism and industrial society. In our shared lectures this week, I'm going to try to do a rapid whirlwind tour through a number of the names that you'll see again and again in the text that we'll look at this term. In this case, I want to focus on some of the texts that are more frequently drawn on by what becomes sociology, by social theory. Connell has discussed the fact that in the 20th century, sociology reconfigures itself as a discipline of what happens in the industrial core, and she says that this obliterates an earlier history where sociologists were engaging with matters in the periphery. What I want to do is capture some of these figures around the transition that she's talking to, who are talking quite heavily about matters in the industrial core, but who are often a little more explicitly engaging with issues in the periphery or engaging with the confrontation with world history, so that that's a little bit more visible and close to the surface. And these are figures that a lot of later texts are going to either use or kick back on and criticize. So one of the themes that's quite close to the surface in earlier forms of social and political theory is the issue of private property and why private property is legitimate. And some of what is in the background of this is the confrontation with newly discovered parts of the world, is the experience of appropriation and the question of why that's valid, and also the beginnings of contestations over the distribution of income within the core. So within the center of Europe, the sorts of income inequalities that are arising as a result of the development of capitalism are causing a lot of theorization around property, who has it, who doesn't, and how this can be considered legitimate. So John Locke is a figure that you'll hear referenced quite often as we go through the course. He writes, among many other things, a quite famous piece called the Second Treatise on Government, and we'll look at it both in this lecture and in the parallel lecture looking at political theory. So in one of the sections of this treatise, he asks, in terms of his religious beliefs, God gave the earth to humans in common. He expects his readers to all agree that this is something that happened, that God gives the earth to humans. And he says, well, given this, how is private property justified? So we've got a religious tradition that the earth belongs to humans to be held in common, and yet, in fact, people own bits of the earth as their own private possession. Why is this legitimate? And specifically, given that there is a general social contract theory discussion, that governments become legitimate because at some point there was a contract where people consented to the authority of governments, does that notion apply as well to property? Do we need to get the consent of everyone that could be involved in the commons in order to privatize part of the commons? He says the consent is not required. And it's not required because nature has to be appropriated in order to become useful. And appropriating it means doing something to it with your own labor that transforms its nature and makes it useful. He says that although God gave the earth to humans in common, he also gave each person the possession of their own labor. So your own labor doesn't belong to people in common, it belongs to yourself. And when you combine your own labor with nature, that creates private property. Okay, so you've made a useful thing, and in doing that, you've removed that thing from the commons. And he does an interesting qualification. He says, at least this applies where there is enough and as good left in common for others. So there's a possibility for critique that's built into this argument. If there is a shortage, if there's not enough natural resource to go around, it may not be good enough to combine your labor with nature and say that it's yours. He has another interesting passage here. So far we've been reading and we've been thinking he's talking about your personal labor. And yet he's got a sentence in here that indicates that the referent is a bit wider than that. He says, thus the grass my horse has bit, the turfs my servant has cut, and the ore I have digged in any place where I have a right to them in common with others, become my property, without the assignation or consent of anybody. So we've been speaking as though we're talking about your personal labor, you're going and you're gathering acorns, or you're planting crops and you're harvesting them. But it turns out that you can have other things, other living things that you own. You can have horses, and indeed you can have people who are working for you, whose labor, when invested on your direction, still makes the thing your property. And this is something that later figures like Marx are going to make fun of quite a lot. And then he raises the question, what prevents someone from just consuming too much of the common, from mixing their labor with a vast amount of it, and shutting everyone else and creating shortage. And he says there's a divine boundary to this, that God hasn't given you the right to grab hold of more property than you can actually make use of. So if you're spoiling it or destroying it, you don't have a right of property in it. But then he also says nature is so plentiful that conflicts are unlikely. And if conflicts are going to happen, then you do need a process of consent. Now this is very, very interesting. Why is nature regarded as so plentiful? Well, in part because there is this experience of the huge widening of our sense of what the world is. And there is also a projection, on the part of many European theorists, a projection onto other parts of the world, that those lands do not seem to the Europeans to be developed, to have been cultivated, to have been actively maintained, and therefore they look like a common. And because they look like a common, they are something that can be claimed as private property if the Europeans will mix their labors, or the labors of their servants, as it turns out, into that land. Okay, and so notions or ways that one can tend to the land that are not immediately recognizable and parsable to the Europeans as, say, traditional agricultural cultivation, make the land perceived as though it is fallow and undeveloped, even though in fact it may be quite intensively husbanded using different sorts of techniques that the Europeans are not familiar with. So Locke says, God gave the world to men in common, but since he gave it them for their benefit and the greatest convenience of life they were capable to draw from it, it cannot be supposed that he meant it should always remain common and uncultivated. He gave it to the use of the industrious and the rational, and labor was to be his title to it. So you get this distinction that there are industrial people, rational people, who will go and rationally organize and improve the land, improve what nature provides, and that gives them an entitlement to property in it. So the perception, accurately or not, that a land is a common, that it is uncultivated and undeveloped and left in its natural state, gives you the entitlement to go in and seize it and do something productive with it. And then he says, there's land enough in the world to suffice double the inhabitants, had not the invention of money and the tacit agreement of men to put a value on it introduced by consent larger possessions and a right to them. So it's a quite careful sentence, and he'll go on in the rest of his document to develop this idea. I won't go into that today, about how it is that you can get even larger possessions that are clearly more than the possessor could personally use, but there's been a consent to this act around the social convention of money. Okay, so how do we rationalize private property? Leads to a critique of whether we can rationalize private property, and a critique of this particular kind of discourse that explains why some people have property and why some people don't. So here's Marx. You've got all of these passages, by the way, in your handouts for this week, so you can look at them at greater length if you'd like to. And Marx is extremely critical. He is a very sarcastic writer. There's a real barbed element to how he writes. And in fact, as we'll see in looking at Swift in a moment, sarcasm is in fact one of the major tools of critique in this period. So Marx is sort of dripping with sarcasm at what he calls the foundation myths of political economy. And he calls this particular foundation myth one about how you get original or primitive accumulation. So the political economists trying to rationalize the distribution of property today end up projecting back on a fantasized past where they think that property came from in a way to make current day property relations look legitimate. Okay, and Marx is scathing. He says, this primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell on the human race. Okay, so somebody does something in an earlier time, and then it has consequences for all their heirs. Its origin, that is property, is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote of the past. In times gone by, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. The legend of original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow. But the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is no means essential. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except their own skins. Now Marx is making an interesting theological point here. So Locke is saying that God gave humans the land in common and gave it to them so that they could develop better ways of living, that they could develop it to their capacity and to their convenience. The theological myth is darker than this, and Marx hits on it. It's meant to explain the need to labor as a punishment. So Locke is already doing something quite different with the theology, and then Marx is coming up and explaining the cynical side, that what this is doing is explaining current-day property relations by claiming that way, way back in the past, there were responsible people and irresponsible people, and the descendants of those irresponsible people are the current-day poor. Marx isn't impressed. Then what Marx does is says, look, even at its most basic, you cannot say that this is where property came from. So aside from the whole issue of whether it is fair that people today should be punished because of things people did hundreds or thousands of years ago, it's really actually not how it happened. This is a myth. It is not how people came into property. The way they came into property is immense violence, is seizing it by force from people who did have it of right. And he talks about the enclosure of land in the core, and he also talks about colonization. And the section, and there are longer quotes from it in the handout, is talking about the intense violence of this process. So it is not that you have industrious, responsible people who are going and improving the land. It is in fact that you've got pillage, that you've got violence and conquest. He says, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for commercial hunting of black skins, signalize the rosy dawn of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief mementa of primitive accumulation. On their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations, with the globe for a theater. Okay, so Marx is saying that these theories about where property comes from are themselves already forms of denial aimed at suppressing the experience of colonization and the violence of it. So these sarcastic terminologies, these idyllic proceedings, this rosy dawn dripping with blood. Okay, so we have a debate over property and we have a debate over poverty. Why do we have poverty? Where do the poor come from? And then tacitly, who's responsible for doing something about it? Jonathan Swift is a satirist. He writes a number of satires. The one we're going to take a brief look at here, and it's in the handout in its entirety, is called A Modest Proposal. And it's meant to make fun of the way in which political economists write their proposals for the betterment of humankind, and a way that Swift thinks they use economic calculations to talk about quite sinister things in a very neutral way. And to make clear what is sinister about the discourse that he's criticizing, he comes up with a proposal that he thinks on its face is so obviously absurd and so obviously abhorrent that it will jar people into recognizing that, to a slightly lesser degree, we're making these kinds of calculations all the time when we're throwing around cost-benefit analyses for where to ship the poor off to other parts of the world, or how to lock them in workhouses, or the other kinds of things that people are trying to do with the poor. And so what he proposes is that we can solve the issue of poverty and crime in Ireland, and we can achieve great benefit for the human race by cultivating all the excess Irish children and selling them for food. Okay, and it is meant to mimic and make fun of the styles of theorizing that it's deploying itself. And so he says, I've been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. I make no doubt it will equally serve in a fricassee or ragout. I grant this food will be somewhat dear, and therefore very popular for landlords, who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children. Okay, so he makes clear, he cues you at various points in the piece that he's not being serious, but there is a serious critical point to be made. So he's saying that it's not so far distant what he's proposing from the ways that people are already driven into poverty, they're driven into famine, they're driven into starvation, they're being killed by systemic processes and by what he regards as the greed of particular classes of people, in ways that he thinks he can make people recognize by just pushing them to that much more extreme. I've already computed, he says, the charge of nursing a beggar's child, in which list I reckon all cottagers, labourers, and 4/5 of the farmers, to be about 2 shillings per annum, rags included. And I believe no gentleman would repine to give 10 shillings for the carcass of a good fat child, which, as I've said, will make 4 dishes of excellent nutritive meat, when he hath only some particular friend or his own family to dine with him. Okay? Precise economic calculation, including the rags that will be required to clothe the children, and a precise calculation of the amount of nutritional value. So he's lampooning, he's satirizing a tradition of making these sorts of calculations when there is a human cost involved that is being disguised by the mathematical precision. And then we have one of the sorts of people, Malthus is writing later, but engaging in the sorts of analysis that Swift is trying to satirize. Malthus is a figure that is very controversial. His works are still used and will see debates over Malthusianism at various points as we move forward through the course. The arguments over Malthus continue to the present day. He writes an essay on the principle of population, and it is meant as a critique of optimistic notions that you can perfect society, that you can perfect humanity, that you can raise everyone up to a very high level of civilization. Malthus thinks that there are natural laws that prevent this from happening, and he starts with 2 general laws. The first is that humans need food, and the second is that he doesn't think they're going to stop wanting to reproduce. Okay, so we need to feed the people that we make, but we're not going to be likely to stop making people. And he thinks that everyone would agree to these laws, and that as we watch them play out, it's going to prevent any kind of general perfectibility of human societies. He says in the very famous line, population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. So 2 parents produce more children, who produce more children, who produce more children, and you get a big explosion in human population. Subsistence, so agricultural production, increases only in an arithmetical ratio. Okay, so he doesn't think there's going to be any way for agriculture to keep up with increases in population. He thinks that poverty is a consequence of how these 2 laws interact, and it keeps the population in check through things like famine and starvation and disease and the other consequences that flow when you don't have enough subsistence, when you don't have enough food to support everyone. And he says, this appears insurmountable in the way to the perfectibility of society. I see no way by which man can escape from the weight of this law which pervades all animated nature. No fancied equality, okay, so it's anti-egalitarian, no agrarian regulations in their utmost extent, so nothing the state can do, could remove the pressure of it, even for a single century. And it appears, therefore, to be decisive against the possible existence of a society, all members of which should live in ease, happiness, and comparative leisure, and feel no anxiety about providing the means of subsistence for themselves and their families. So there are utopian ideals that are floating around at the time that Malthus is writing. And he's saying it's not going to be possible. You will not be able to get a society in which everybody lives comfortably, because quite quickly they'll reproduce in very large numbers, and then that will do away with the comfort. And there's nothing you can do about this. No matter how equal you make people, no matter what the state does, this is your inevitable consequence. Consequently, he says, if the premises are just, the argument is conclusive against the perfectibility of the mass of mankind. Okay? And there are debates that are going on now. So some of the premises don't seem to have been just. In fact, the rate of reproduction seems to fall off as societies get wealthy. Is it going to fall off enough? How much more give do we have in our capacity to produce food? Okay? We've had huge increases in the yield from agricultural reproduction in the last several decades. Is that going to be able to continue? And there are fights over this, and we'll pick them up again later in the term. But here's Marx again. Marx particularly despises Malthus, as you would expect, because Marx is trying to come up with a form of society where people can live at their ease and their leisure and comfortably and in equality. And so Malthus is a major target of his. He really loathes him. And what Marx says is that Malthus is projecting purely social laws onto nature. And Marx thinks a lot of the political economists do this, that they're picking up on patterns and regularities that really do exist, but these patterns are arising due to something specific about a particular society, in this case capitalist society, and they are not natural laws that humans can always be governed by. Marx says that capitalism is characterized by contradictory tendencies that have an impact on population. On the one hand, it tends to revolutionize production in a way that greatly increases productivity. And as productivity increases, you don't need as many people, you don't need as much labor to produce the same amount of stuff. Okay? That's one tendency, and if that were the only tendency, it would be no particular problem. If it were okay for people to be unemployed, you could just continue to throw them out of the workplace. Productivity would remain the same, we'd still have the same amount of physical stuff to consume. But that's not the only tendency. There's also a tendency to need labor to be expended in new forms. Capital is restless, it innovates, it runs into new forms of production. So there are checks on the tendency to just let people become unemployed and wealthy. The system is set up such that people acquire the means of their basic subsistence from working. And it means that if they're unemployed, it is a crisis. And if enough people are unemployed, it becomes a social crisis. So capitalism is characterized for Marx by a constant displacement and reconstitution of the need for human labor, and often in crisis-ridden forms, such that you can quite suddenly end up with masses of people who don't have the means to support themselves. And then you go through other periods of time where, in fact, every available possible human who's willing and able to work can be incorporated into the productive process. Okay? In the periods where you've got a crisis and large numbers of people are suddenly dumped out unemployed, Marx thinks that these are creating this sensation that there is a natural tendency to overpopulation of people who can't support themselves. In fact, in other points in the business cycle, they'd be perfectly able to support themselves. So a social process is being confused for a natural process for Marx. He says the laboring population therefore produces, along with the accumulation of capital produced by it, the means by which it itself is made relatively superfluous. It is turned into a surplus population. And it does this to an always increasing extent. This is a law of population peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. The first word of this adaptation is the creation of a relative surplus population, or industrial reserve army. That's a very famous phrase, the industrial reserve army. Its last word is the misery of constantly extending strata of the active army of labor and the dead weight of pauperism. So as people are tossed out of production, since their labor is the only thing they've got to secure the means of subsistence for themselves, they look like a surplus population that is being hurt by a natural process, which is starvation. Okay? And at the point that Marx is writing, you might have various forms of charity through the church, but you don't have a welfare state. Okay, today we do have a welfare state, but if large numbers of people start using the benefits of that state, you get discourses that oppose the number of people. But Marx says it looks like a natural process is going on. It looks like you've got people who are so poor they can't feed themselves, and this can be mistaken as though there's not enough food. In fact, these people in rosier economic climates are quite able to support themselves, but there can be confused. It can look as though there is a natural process that's causing them to starve. And he says the political economists confuse this, so there's a regularity to this pattern. You regularly look like you've got too many and too few people. And it can look like you're getting too many people, and then natural forces kick in and they die off in large numbers, and then the population goes back to normal. But in fact, the cyclical quality of this has a lot more to do with the cycles of capitalism, Marx says, than it does with any kind of natural cycle. You don't see this kind of cycle in non-capitalist societies, Marx says, even though you may have famines and you may have things that go wrong for natural reasons. Okay? And then he points out particularly one of the reasons you know that this is not a natural society is the way, in fact, that the state behaves at particular moments in the cycle. So he says, every combination of employed and unemployed disturbs the harmonious action of this law. So when you get people who labor who can work together politically, you get forces that try to counteract this law. On the other hand, as soon as, for example, in the colonies, and again, Marx has a very global conception of capitalism, so he's very attentive to what's going on in the colonies. As soon as in the colonies adverse circumstances prevent the creation of an industrial reserve army, so what the adverse circumstances are, he thinks, is that in the colonies, it's easy to sort of run away, to grab land, and to make your own subsistence living. And where people are able to make subsistence living, it is in fact historically very, very difficult to force them to work in capitalist conditions. People are very resistant to it. So where people are resistant to it, he says you get capitalists rebelling against the sacred law of supply and demand, tries to check its inconvenient action by forcible means and state interference. Okay, so when things are working well, it's fine to talk about the sacred laws of supply and demand and to let economic forces govern the distribution of labor. But in fact, if things are not going so well, if you're having difficulty getting the workforce you need, capitalism has no reluctance about bringing in the state and forcibly making people leave. There are huge famines in the period in which Marx is writing in England, some of which are driven by the fact that people are prevented from immigrating and going elsewhere because of a recognition that they'll be needed once business picks back up and there's a place to employ them. Okay, so Marx has in mind things like this in Ireland, in England, and in other places. Okay, so creation of poverty, is it natural? Is it driven by capitalism? Even if it is driven by capitalism, are the sorts of natural crises that we're confronting today things that make Malthus perhaps more applicable now than he has been? These are things that we're going to see people arguing about as we go forward in the course. And then you have a third stream, which is a major preoccupation with the division of labor and the difference between the division of labor under capitalism or in modern history and the division of labor historically. And this is something that is thematized already in the 18th century, but continues to be a preoccupation. There is something different about how we divide up responsibilities and how people did in the past. Adam Smith makes a distinction between something that's often called the social division of labor, which is this gradual process that exists as far back in time as we have records, where you have some people who specialize in certain occupations and they trade their services with people who specialize in others. He talks about it being the unintentional outcome of tendency in human nature, and that tendency for Smith is the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Now, there are other kinds of divisions of labors and specializations that are not driven by exchange and are not mediated by exchange. And so you'll see some later authors taking Smith to task for this. For example, you can have a division of labor in a family or a division of labor in a community that doesn't have anything to do with people making their goods and then swapping them with each other. You can see a little bit of Locke's fantasy space in this notion. But the other thing that Smith talks about is something that's often called a detailed division of labor. And he's got this incredible image that you can see in the handout of the process of manufacturing a pin. And it's subdivided into 18 distinct operations, each of which is done by a specialized laborer. And you get enormous productivity increases when you break the labor process down that way. You also get enormous stunting of the laborer themselves. So it's not like being a farmer or a doctor or some whole profession where in the course of doing your specialized job, you're still moving back and forth between many different kinds of activities. If you're doing 1/18 of the manufacture of a pin, you're doing the same activity repetitively over and over and over again. And the wear and tear on the worker is quite different. And Smith's conscious of this. It's one of the reasons that he's one of the figures that advocates for some sort of public education, okay, to round out and to counter the effects of this sort of intense industrial division of labor. Smith has a phrase that you will almost certainly have already heard, the invisible hand. Okay, what's the invisible hand about? And it's in the process actually of addressing a debate over how much free trade you can have and how likely industry would be to wander offshore if you did that, how damaging it might be for local production. But what he says is that the division of labor in a complex social sense integrates people who don't have any conscious desire to be integrated with one another. It forms a very complex sort of interdependency socially. And it is created non-consciously. No one sets out to decide that people will be related in this particular way. Smith says, by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. So the worker or the person who's running a capitalist factory isn't trying to do something for the whole of society, is not trying to do anything of general benefit. They're just seeking their own gain, their own profit. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worst for society that it was no part of it. Okay, and Smith goes on to be very, very cynical about people who are in business, who claim they're altruistic, who claim they're doing things for others' benefit. His point is that you don't need to be in it for other people's benefit, that if the system is set up properly, you can pursue your own gain, and the unintentional side effect of your action will be a complex form of social interdependence that is to the benefit of everyone. Okay, and this is something that people will pick up on, that they will believe in, and also that they will criticize very sharply as we go forward during the term. Okay. One of the things that Smith doesn't wrestle with is the difference between the social division of labor, where people specialize in the manufacture of particular things and trade them, and the detailed division of labor, which is actually something that goes on in a large manufacturing concern or a factory. The social division of labor is the one where you can conceptualize it as people making a thing and going and trading it with other people. But the detailed division of labor generally is planned. It is generally occurring under the direction of someone who is running a manufacturing operation. And although there is something being traded, what's being traded is just labor time, the amount of time you're going to spend there working under someone else's direction. Okay? And there are tensions between those things that Smith doesn't entirely work out. Emil Durkheim, looking at the same issue over 100 years later, talking about the fact that you've had some sort of division of labor for a very long time, mentioning Adam Smith, but recognizing more clearly than Smith does that there's something different between the detailed division of labor, which is quite new, and the long-term division of labor that might have existed as long as we've had historical records. Durkheim characterizes modern industry as needing and promoting what he calls an extreme division of labor. Okay. So specialization is sort of built into modern societies in a way that is not characteristic of previous ones. And he sees it as something that happens not only in economic life, but in politics, in administration, in law. Those of you who read the Habermas or the Latour piece last week will have a sense about this argument about specialization, that modernity is regarded as particularly differentiated, particularly specialized to a historically unprecedented degree. What Durkheim wants to know is, what is the impact of this extreme division of labor on social solidarity, on our ability to get along with one another? And what he says is that in non-modern societies, solidarity is what he calls mechanical solidarity. It's a very strange word to use for it. Mechanical solidarity for Durkheim is being able to have a bond with other people because you are extremely similar to them. You're more or less identical, you more or less do the same things, you more or less have the same beliefs. And so you get along because of your likeness to other people. Modern societies aren't like that, and so at the point that Durkheim is writing, people are beginning to worry, maybe the center can't hold, maybe modern societies aren't like this, and we're just going to split apart. There have been revolutions, there has been uprisings, there's been a lot of social unrest. Is this just our fate in a modern context? And Durkheim says, no, not necessarily. That you can get something that he calls organic solidarity. He calls it organic solidarity because he thinks it's like the kind of cohesion that you see in physical bodies, where you've got different organs in the bodies and they perform different functions, but together they contribute to a properly functioning, harmonious whole. And he thinks that you can get this from the kinds of differentiation and even the extreme division of labor that you have in a modern society. However, it's risky. And there's a risk, and the term he uses is anomie, lawlessness, social disorder, that in a period of rapid change, you've not had the ability to establish some sort of organic solidarity, and you can get a breakdown of social bonds because the change has been too rapid and people are not equipped to adjust. And again, this is a major preoccupation, how people can get along, how similar, do we need similarity? You can see this in some of the current day debates over multiculturalism. Okay? Is it viable for us to have a functioning society with people with whom we are radically dissimilar? Okay? And Durkheim's trying to look into what the conditions of possibility are for that. And our final figure for this lecture is Max Weber, a prominent political economist, very influential in sociology, a bit less so in political theory, but some of his ideas, particularly on bureaucracy, are very influential there. Weber is looking not at the concrete details of the division of labor, but at why we start, in his words, rationally managing our labor and planning its use in this very systematic form that is associated with a detailed division of labor. And I've included a couple of things in the handout. One is an introduction that's published with his book, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, but that was actually written to introduce a whole series of studies that he does on different religions. So we'll take a look at that first, and then we'll look at the actual argument of the Protestant Ethic book as well. This is one of these things that sort of everybody knows the title of the book, but often the actual argument is heavily misunderstood. So in the introduction, Weber says, why is Western civilization distinctive? And he really goes for it here. He wants to know why it has universal significance for humankind. He doesn't ask, does it have universal significance? He takes for granted that it does, and then he runs through and he points out all of these different areas where he thinks that there's something superior, and they include things like music and architecture and a lot of other things. But what he's interested in is capitalism. And he calls capitalism the most fateful force in our modern life. And then he makes an extremely interesting argument about what capitalism isn't. He says, the impulse to acquisition, pursuit of gain, of money, of the greatest possible amount of money, has in itself nothing to do with capitalism. It's very, very interesting, because for a lot of people this is quintessentially what capitalism is, and there are a lot of critiques of capitalism based on the notion that it's greedy. Weber says it's not the point. This impulse, as in the desire for infinite amounts of money, exists and has existed among waiters, physicians, coachmen, artists, prostitutes, dishonest officials, soldiers, nobles, crusaders, gamblers, and beggars. One may say that it has been common to all sorts and conditions of men at all times and in all countries of the earth, wherever the objective possibility of it has been given. Okay, so Weber says, greed, nothing new. All kinds of people, all times and places, would be greedy, if allowed, would accumulate and accumulate and accumulate vast amounts of money. And he says, it should be taught in the kindergarten of cultural history that this naive ideal of capitalism must be given up once and for all. Weber is extremely frustrated, arguing with other people who think this is what capitalism is about. So if that's not what capitalism is about, and a lot of people have argued that that is what it's about, if it's not what it's about, what is it about? And Weber says, unlimited greed for gain is not in the least identical with capitalism. It's still less its spirit is driving force. Capitalism may even be identical with the restraint, or at least rational tempering, of this irrational impulse. So capitalism somehow lines up with rationality. Greed for greed's sake lines up with irrationality. But he says capitalism is identical with the pursuit of profit, and forever renewed profit, by means of continuous, rational, capitalistic enterprise. In a wholly capitalistic order of society, an individual capitalistic enterprise which did not take advantage of its opportunities for profit-making would be doomed to extinction. So he's saying it's not greed, and yet you're going to have to pursue profit, you're going to have to keep pursuing profit, there is no end point to that pursuit, but somehow that's not identical with greed. What does it mean? He's implying already in this sentence that there's some external factors that mean that if you don't seek profit, you're going to go under. So whether you want it or not, if you don't seek it, there are social consequences. And then he says modern capitalism is distinguished by the rational capitalistic organization of formally free labor. And he says there are a couple of other things that are distinctive. Businesses tend to be separated from households. That's, interestingly, a sociological trend that's begun to reverse recently. And he talks about rational bookkeeping, so monitoring everything, calculating everything. But he says you wouldn't be able to do these kinds of calculations if you didn't have free labor. And again, there are people who will argue with this. So Weber says, in a universal history of culture, the central problem for us is not, in the last analysis, the development of capitalistic activity as such. It's rather the origin of this sober bourgeois capitalism with its rational organization of free labor. So there is a level of planning, and again, this is a similar sort of concept to the detailed division of labor if you recognize that someone is directing that detailed division. Intense planning, intense measurement, intense calculation leads to the rational pursuit of a restless and what Weber is going to regard as sort of irrational end. Okay? And he says the question is why this would ever happen. And he says, well, religious beliefs would often have prevented this kind of thing from happening. So the question becomes an issue of the analysis of religion. What kinds of myths, what kinds of religious beliefs made it possible for people to start focusing on this kind of boundless accumulation, but in this very rationally mediated kind of way? And here's where the actual argument of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism fits in. For Weber, capitalism is strangely ascetic. And again, this will strike many people as unusual. We're used to thinking of it as being hedonistic, as having something to do with lots and lots of consumption and overconsumption. But Weber says why it's ascetic is that it's generating huge amounts of profits that are being poured back into ongoing investment rather than consumed. Okay, so there's a tacit contrast here to the notion that at an earlier period, people might have just consumed this stuff or destroyed it to display that they could do without it. But here we take the profits and we put them back in and grow again and put them back in and grow again and put them back in. And Weber says that's ascetic. Okay, we're denying ourselves the ability to consume that bit of the product in order to keep growing the business. It's like the business is more important than the people who are part of it. And he says that this became thinkable, this became something people could do, no matter how weird the activity is, because of a very particular, unique cultural and religious configuration. And here's where he thinks Protestantism fits in. So in Protestantism, you can't become a monk, you can't withdraw from the world and go out somewhere else and be a religious ascetic. You have to be an ascetic in the middle of your everyday existence. So personal consumption is viewed as sinful, just as it might have been if you were going to be in a monastery. But you're in the middle of the world, and you're engaging in your everyday activities, which may include your business activities. And success in worldly affairs was viewed as a possible sign of God's favor. Okay, and I'm mangling this argument a bit, it's more sophisticated than this. But in a context where success in worldly affairs is viewed as a sign that you're doing right, that there's something religiously sound about you, and yet personal consumption is viewed as sinful, you get a situation where people are likely to make large amounts of money because it shows God's favor, but they can't spend it, so they just keep pouring it back into the business and growing rational capitalistic enterprises. And the rationality of it Weber likens to what would have happened in the monastery, where activities were very regulated and were very observed and were conducted that way as a form of self-discipline as part of the religious worship. Those are carried over for Weber into the business space. And he says, this isn't the case today. So one of the unintended consequences of this religious movement was building a set of institutions that have made it such that even if you don't want to do this, even if you have no religious belief of this kind at all, there are institutions that force you to do it. You have to conform to an ideal of ascetic accumulation, to run a business, or even to be a laborer. Okay, you have to save for your retirement. You have to save for periods when you no longer have to work. You have to harness your resources and plan for the future. So you get a whole society of people, for Weber, behaving like these old Protestants, even though their belief systems may have nothing in common with those belief systems. Weber says, the Puritan wanted to work in a calling. We are forced to do so. For when asceticism was carried out of monastic cells and into everyday life and began to dominate worldly morality, it did its part in building the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order. So the modern economy strikes us as a natural environment. It strikes us as a cosmos. It strikes us as something beyond anyone's individual control, and it impacts on us in the way that nature might impact on us. This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all the individuals who are born into this mechanism, not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition, with irresistible force. Okay, so there are forces and pressures on us that have nothing to do with our beliefs, and if we do not conform to those, there are stark social consequences. Perhaps it will so determine them until the last ton of fossilized coal is burnt. It's a line with particular resonance today. In Baxter's view, the care for external goods should only lie on the shoulders of the saint like a light cloak, which can be thrown aside at any moment. But fate decreed that the cloak should become an iron cage. Very famous line. You will see it referred to later in the term. We have now fallen into a system that is beyond our control, and it is preventing us from making choices based on different systems of values. Whether that's true, whether that's too pessimistic, whether people are in fact participating in this because it's what they want and would freely choose, these are things that are going to be debated as we go through the term.